What are the expectations for Desmond Ridder heading into this 2023 season? I'll give you mine on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. Follow in the footsteps that have been pioneered by the everydayers out there by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So we are wrapping up Locked On Desmond Ridder week today. We'll be answering a couple of your listener questions. Not a whole lot to talk about from OTAs, some interesting wrinkles or whatever. Maybe we'll get into some of those things next week on the podcast, but nothing major really stood out. Keith Smith got arrested for having an expired license. That was probably the big news of that, but that's pretty much a non-issue. Interesting to see Avery Williams get some work at wide receiver during practices, and Bijan getting some work at wide receiver during practices. We've talked a little bit about that, so maybe we'll go a little bit deeper into that next week on some various topics. But let's talk a little bit. We talked about all the interactions between Desmond Ridder and Drake London, Desmond Ridder, Kyle Pitts, and Desmond Ridder in the run game, and Desmond Ridder versus man coverage all throughout the week on this Locked On Desmond Ridder episode. And so let's close out the week by talking about sort of my expectations for Desmond Ridder, right? And my expectations are that he will have an up and down 2023 season, right? And my hope is that we'll see him, overall, this Falcons offense be comparable, hopefully better, but comparable to what we've seen the last couple of years under Arthur Smith, where, as you may recall, they were 19th in efficiency. If you look at an efficiency metric like adjusted net yards per attempt or ANYA, they were 19th in 2021. They were 17th in 2022. And that's kind of roughly where I kind of expect them, somewhere in that 15 to 20 range, around league average. In terms of what I think Desmond Ridder can provide this offense from a passing efficiency metric. And I certainly think there's reasons to be optimistic that Desmond Ridder can be more than that. I think the sort of ceiling, at least for me, in terms of my expectation of what Desmond Ridder will be in this first full season as a starter, is maybe a Geno Smith-esque year. We saw Geno Smith obviously play well last year and win the comeback player of the year. And a lot of that is owed to how well Geno Smith played in the months of October and November. It just feels funny. There's after Geno Smith lost to the Falcons in week 3, like he went on this tear for like the next 8 weeks and was like top 5 in top 3 in a lot of efficiency metrics like EPA and adjusted net yards per attempt between October and November. Now, outside of that 8-game stretch, Geno was well below average last season. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, Desmond Ridder has to be, go on that sort of run that Geno did in the middle of the season or have 8 games like that. But there should be a stretch, whether they're a stretch of games or sprinkled throughout the season, there should be, let's say 4 to 6, if not more games where we see really efficient play from Desmond Ridder this year, similar to what we saw with Marcus Mariota in that 49ers game, similar to what we saw from Matt Ryan in his year under Arthur Smith in 2021, where there was a couple of games where Matt Ryan, really played well in those games. And then outside of that, not so much. And so I think with Desmond Ridder, the biggest pitfall that a lot of people are going to have to deal with in the lead up to the season is being wary of arbitrary expectations. And, I think a lot of people, because of reasons, and that's why it's arbitrary, it's just no real reason, but it's just like, Desmond Ridder has to be X in order to justify the Falcons' decision to stick with him. He has to be better than this player, Justin Fields or Trey Lance or Lamar Jackson or, whoever, right? And, this is similar to something I talked about on yesterday's episode, where I think a lot of the negativity and pushback that Kyle Pitts has gotten is because people feel like he has to justify the Falcons taking him at 4. And so therefore he has to, put up Travis Kelce numbers every single year in order to justify that selection. And that's not fair to Kyle Pitts. That's not really fair to any player to put those arbitrary expectations. That's what I mean. Where it's just like you just decided in your own head that this is what a player has to be because he got drafted at this point or he got paid this amount or whatever, arbitrary expectations you have in your brain. And basically, to me, Kyle Pitts just has to be the best version of Kyle Pitts. And we're getting that player is basically what I'm saying. I said on yesterday's episode, and so therefore no one should be disappointed with what Kyle Pitts. And the same thing applies to Desmond Ridder. He has to be the best version of Desmond Ridder, whatever that player winds up being. And another way I would compare it to is going way back in the day on this podcast, back when they were when this podcast was the Falcons Fans podcast and hosted by Alan Sturck and myself, and we were a weekly show way back in like 2013 and 2014. And I remember with O.C. Umenyiora, when the Falcons signed O.C. Umenyiora to replace John Abraham, I was very critical of that move because I didn't think the Falcons should have moved on from John Abraham at that point. And we saw him go on to have a very successful 2013 season with the Arizona Cardinals. But I kind of needed OC to be basically John Abraham light in order to justify that decision. And if you listen to the podcast back in 2013, you would hear on a weekly basis me constantly taking shots at OC Umenyiora. But then you fast forward the following year and, myself and Alan as well, were often very praising of OC on the podcast the next year. And what changed, and I can't speak for Alan, but I can speak for myself, is what happened is after the 2013 season, rather than holding OC to this, standard of he has to be John Abraham, it was like, no, you just got to be the best version of OC Umenyiora. And I think we got that player in 2014. And now I have nothing but positive things to say about OC Umenyiora and have had nothing but positive things to say about him for the better part of the last decade, despite the fact that if you can somehow find those old 2013 episodes, and good luck finding them on the internet now, it's just a weekly OC bashing session. And so, that's what I mean, where I think like you have to hold play, like you obviously have to have standards for players, right? But like at the same time, like you don't have to necessarily raise the bar based off of arbitrary expectations, which, I'm using OC as an example of like, I had this arbitrary expectation that he had to be 75% of John Abraham in order to justify the Falcons moving him. And it's like, no, he doesn't have to be that. He just has to be, he just got to help this team win football games. And I think the same rules apply to all players on the Falcons roster, including Desmond Ridder. And my hope is for what we'll see from Desmond Ridder and this Falcons team this year is improvement in several key areas, right? Desmond Ridder is going to be asked to be a game manager. Let's be honest about that. And I know that term, is often a pejorative when it comes to the quarterback position. But, at this stage in his career, he's no different than a lot of young quarterbacks. My hope for Desmond Ridder and his Falcons offense is that you will see improvement in some of these key areas that tell you that, they're effectively managing the game. They were 10th in third down efficiency last year. They were 14th in red zone efficiency last year. They were 15th in scoring this year. So to me, if the Falcons improve in those areas, then that's a very successful season for Desmond Ridder and this football team, even if it's, going up a notch or two on those rankings. And even if they decline in some of those areas, as long as it's not a massive dip and they go from like, 10th to 25th in third down efficiency or 15th to 27th in scoring, I still wouldn't necessarily look at that as, a bad performance from Desmond Ridder in the team. We'll just hope that we get improvements in that area. And the last thing I'll say before we move on is, I remember bringing this up a couple of years ago towards the end of Matt Ryan's tenure and talking about the high standard that I had for Matt Ryan. And I basically remember saying things like, I don't have the same standard for Matt Ryan that I do for Andy Dalton, because Matt Ryan has a body of work that tells you that he's one of the better quarterbacks in the league, borderline Hall of Fame caliber quarterback. And I think I used to say things like an average day for Matt Ryan would be like a very good day for Andy Dalton. Now, with Desmond Ridder, I'm not going to hold him to that Matt Ryan standard. I didn't hold Matt Ryan to that standard until he was like 5 to 7 years into his NFL career. So he was a long established player of that. So I will say, Desmond Ridder will be held to the Andy Dalton standard. So what will be considered average play in the past from a Falcons quarterback may be considered. We're sitting here singing the praises of Desmond Ridder on this podcast this year for those types of performances. And again, I'm sure there will be people out there that don't agree with praising mediocrity, but I think the battle that these quarterbacks have to overcome to be good in the NFL, like, just being decent is a hill that they have to climb, right? It's not guaranteed in this league. So we'll see whether or not Desmond Ridder lives up to those expectations. But we'll talk a little bit more about, how the opening game scripts are going to impact our evaluation of Desmond Ridder and whether or not they're going to be different at home versus on the road to help Desmond Ridder avoid those slow starts that were often the case last year in his 4 starts. And we'll also talk a little bit about the linebacker core, where we have another young player in Troy Anderson who's expected to make a big leap forward similar to Desmond Ridder this year. So we'll get into that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But first, I want to let you know about the delicious snack that doesn't force you have to deal with all the sugar and calories that normally come with it. And that is, of course, Built Bar, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, but despite that, they're low in sugar, they're low in calories. They have a whopping 17 grams of protein. They come in a variety of great flavors. I went myself today, before recording this episode, to built.com, ordered myself a couple of boxes of the red velvet puff bar. I think they have a very vanilla puff bar that I got. And I got the coconut brownie chunk puff bar, and the puffs are the protein infused marshmallow that Built Bars had, and I'm gonna get those next week with the shipping. Went to built.com, used the promo code locked on 15, still get 15% off. Been using that promo code for 3 years now at this point in time. So always appreciate the folks at Built for continuing to allow me to get that discount, and you guys can get that discount as well by using that promo code locked on 15 at built.com. And whether you're shopping online or you're out and about in the world, if you want to go to Walmart or Sam's Club, you can also find Built Bars there. Walk to the pharmacy section of Walmart, you can get yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, any of the other variety of flavors. Or Sam's Club, you can run in and grab a 13-bar box of brownie batter puff or churro puff. You will thank me later. So we're continuing today's episode, and again, want to give a shout out to all my everydayers that make Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day, and especially those of you that sent in questions, because today we're answering a couple of questions. This first one comes from the Discord from Spacebar. He has, one trend I'm interested in tracking this year is if Ridder still has an issue with slow starts. I don't think it'll be a huge problem for home games, but I do think we could see it manifest on the road. Do you think we'll see a different opening script from Arthur Smith to account for this? And yeah, I'll be curious to see that. We've talked a little bit before about Ridder's tendency to start slow. That was an issue for him at Cincinnati. That continued to be an issue for him in his first 4 starts in the NFL. Obviously, he started even slower in his first 2 starts that happened to be in the road versus his last 2 starts that were at home. He seemed to get a little bit more in the groove earlier in those games that he did against the Saints and Ravens. And usually that's a general trend that we notice with young quarterbacks, especially. This was true of Matt Ryan, where he was very good at home and very mediocre on the road. And I wonder if we'll see a similar dynamic for Desmond Ridder here. As for, does that prompt Arthur Smith to have a different game script, for the road versus home? We'll have to sort of see. I could certainly understand if that was the case. But we'll just have to sort of see if that is an issue that continues to rear its ugly head. I'm sure there will be weeks where Desmond Ridder gives off to a slow start. I'm hoping there will also be weeks where he gets off to a very fast start, and whether or not that falls along the home road dynamics, or it's an every week thing or an every other week thing or a once in a blue moon thing, we'll just have to sort of wait and see on that front. But I hope that answers your question, Spacebar. Our next question comes from Jacob P via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. It says, "Hey, Aaron, I hope this is the right place to reach out to you. I would be interested in hearing your take on the Falcons groups at linebacker. If you could do a bit of a breakdown for the players and their positions, Sam, middle linebacker, etc., and what those positions mean, it would be great. I'm still kind of confused by the whole 3-4 defense. Anyway, thank you for your time." So, the Sam linebacker is the strong side linebacker. It's not quite the way it used to be, but it used to be, for those of you, the strong side of the defense was the strong side of the offense was the side that the tight end lined up on, right? Which is usually the right-hand side of the offense, right? You put your best run blockers on the right side. That's why historically the right tackle was the run blocking tackle. You put the tight end next to him, you run to the right. And so that's the strong side. And so defensively you would match up by putting your biggest, toughest, stoutest linebacker on the strong side over the tight end so that he could, deal with that. And you put like a 200 and, back in the day, it was like 290-pound strong side defensive end on that side. And the Falcons will do that from time to time, particularly this year if they play the 4-3 under and have Calais Campbell be that bigger defensive end, and their strong side linebacker, I'm assuming, is going to be Lorenzo Carter or D'Angelo Malone, probably Carter. The middle linebacker, of course, is the middle linebacker. That's the Mike. That's going to be Troy Anderson. The weak side linebacker is the opposite guy, opposite to the strong side, away from the tight end. Typically the more undersized linebacker, historically speaking, although, again, because of the ways that the NFL is played today with more passing and whatnot, like these old distinctions aren't as true as they used to be, although they still, filter into today's game. The weak side linebacker is expected to be Kaden Ellis. And what was interesting is when the Falcons did dabble in their 4-3 fronts last year, or especially when they used the 4-3 under, they did put Carter at Sam linebacker. I'm expecting them to deploy similar fronts this year. I think the linebacker core as a whole is certainly fair to be, is certainly probably the biggest question mark on the defense, and arguably one of the biggest question marks on the team, besides maybe Desmond Ridder himself. Some of that is owed to the fact that Kaden Ellis is not a household name. And I think we've heard people express skepticism over whether Kaden Ellis is going to, continue to play well. We heard this similar things from Everett Glaze when he was on the podcast not too long ago. But, for me, I expect Kaden Ellis to play well this year. I think he's going to pick up where he left off with the Saints. I have little reason to think that even with a more expanded role than he had in New Orleans, given that, Ryan Nielsen's porting over, some of that scheme here, that there won't be any reason for Kaden Ellis to not have another good season and pick up where he left off. And it would not shock me if Kaden Ellis winds up leading this team in sacks this year, with 8+ sacks this year. And obviously we're hoping that we can get similar, or if not better, production from guys like Arnold Ebiketie and Grady Jarrett this season. But, I think what Kaden Ellis is going to do in this defense is blitz a lot and rush the quarterback a lot on third downs, especially when the Falcons are playing their man coverage defense. And primarily Ellis's role is going to be as a pass rusher, a designated pass rusher. And they'll do various things with their different fronts. So, the distinction between Will and Mike and Sam, and positional distinctions when it comes to nickel and passing downs is less of a thing. It matters in the secondary, but not so much in the fronts, because you just basically like get to the quarterback. Doesn't matter where you line up as long as you get to the quarterback, right? And so, I think the other question about the linebacker position is Troy Anderson. He's very talented, but he's very raw at this point in time. And, I think Jesse Bates will probably be the quarterback of the defense this year, but the goal is for Troy Anderson to kind of be that leader on the defensive side of the ball. And so I'm kind of expecting, similar to Desmond Ridder, a lot of ups and downs with the on the job training that Troy Anderson's going to get this year. And the Falcons are going to find out, they're going to toss him into the ocean and see if he sinks or swims, right? And I'm hoping that he swims, but maybe he sinks. So we'll find out. And certainly, for me, the major concern at the linebacker is not those two guys, because I think Ellis is going to be good. I think Anderson has the potential to be good. So they deserve every opportunity to show that this year. To me, it's the depth that is the main concern I have with the linebacker room. Michael Walker is a valuable, experienced, versatile backup, so he gives you good depth there. But injuries don't always just happen to one guy, right? Like if one guy gets hurt, okay, you plug in Michael Walker, you're good to go. But what happens if two guys get hurt? Then all of a sudden you need that other guy. And right now, you look at the other options of the Falcons at the linebacker room, it's Andre Smith, it's Tay Davis, Nate Landman, Dorian Etheridge. All these guys are relatively unproven at this point in time. And so we'll have to sort of see if those guys are ready to step up and be that fourth linebacker in the event of multiple injuries at the position, or if this is going to be a position that, we get to training camp and those guys don't step up. Do the Falcons address this linebacker depth, heading into the season, right? I think linebacker, their depth there, swing tackle, wide receiver, probably the three positions I would circle heading into training camp that are probably the iffiest in terms of, do you have a viable option on your roster? So we'll see if the Falcons, feel good about that coming out of training camp, about those three spots, or that's something that we will go into the season looking to address. So we'll do some detailed positional breakdowns probably in June towards the end of the month, and probably in July as part of our training camp preview series, where we go position by position and break down, so what are the big questions for the season? What are the big questions of the summer? All those various things, like we did last summer. So we'll go deeper on the linebacker core a little bit, but that's just kind of a general preview of what my expectations are for the linebacker position. So I hope that answers your question, Jacob. And we got another question from the Discord coming up about why, I have been so optimistic about the Falcons this year in relative, when I'm more optimistic about the Falcons relative to the national media, what does that usually lead to in the season? Is my optimism, well founded, or am I going to regret that? And so we'll get into that question to wrap up today's episode. But for those of you like Jacob that are eager to hear my breakdowns of future positions later this summer, of course, make sure you're an everydayer so that you don't miss an episode. And of course, you can subscribe and become an everydayer by subscribing on YouTube or following for free on wherever you listen to podcasts. And I'll give you a heads up for the everydayers that we will do an episode Sunday night. It's probably going to be a Matthew Bergeron episode where I do my detailed breakdown of Matthew Bergeron. So that can be what you can listen to on Memorial Day, Monday, when you're, grilling out there and listening to me talk about Matthew Bergeron kicking D tackles butts. So that will be what the everydayers will be checking out on Memorial Day. So our final question comes from Brigantor. He asks, Aaron, this offseason feels like it's been new territory on the pod, as it's the first time I can recall in my listenership over the past 3 to 4 years when you've been higher on the team than has the national media, and when it feels like you're arguing for upside other than trying to pull some fans back from the extremes. I'm curious if you've been in this place before, being more optimistic about the team, and what your track record with optimistic predictions is. Always felt like your pessimistic prediction unfortunately came true. Judging either way, just curious. So I'm probably not as optimistic about the team as probably some of you might perceive me to be based off of, how many things I'm talking about the team in positive ways. Like I kind of feel like they're probably going to be like a 9-8 team, which is like slightly above their 8.5 win total, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. And I'm guessing that probably most of the national folks will settle in around 7 or 8 wins for the Falcons. We'll see. It feels like there's been a lot more positive national media attention, or at least I've noticed, since the draft. So we'll see if that continues into the summer, and all of a sudden people are like, hey, don't sleep on the Falcons. People have been sleeping on the Falcons, all of off season. So we'll see if that continues. And so therefore maybe I won't be as far off the national consensus by the time we get to August as, it seems to be right now. But, I can't really recall too many instances in the past where I was higher than the national consensus, but a lot of that is owed to, I don't really pay that much attention to what people nationally think about the Atlanta Falcons. If I had to guess, probably the 2015 and 2021 years, I probably was a little bit higher on the team than the national consensus, but that was probably owed mostly to my expectation that we would get the first year bump from having a new coaching staff that, we as Falcon fans, if you go back, have experienced quite a bit, whether it was Jim Moore, whether it was Mike Smith or whatever. And so thinking, okay, Dan Quinn's going to bring that same bump, and same thing with Arthur Smith. And I don't know if the Falcons, they certainly didn't live up to those expectations. I think I probably had them going like 10-6 in 2015 based off of that bump, and they went 8-8. And then of course in 2021, I think I probably had them going like 9-7 or 10-6, and they went 7-9 or something like that. So again, as I said, I don't pay that much attention to the national media. And most of that is because, like, I have an opinion, you have an opinion, they have an opinion. And I know that my opinion is backed off of film study and research and data and all these things. And many of yours and many national people's opinions aren't. And so I don't really pay attention to those opinions because I know my opinion is informed, even if when I'm wrong, like I know I have a more informed opinion than most people do. So why should I pay attention to what anybody else thinks about the Atlanta Falcons when I know I have one of the most informed opinions out there? And again, as arrogant as that sounds, but it is the reality of the situation. Like you don't ask, I don't want to sit here and say I'm an expert or anything like that, but like you don't ask someone who's an expert in their field, like, what do you think this random person thinks about this thing? Like what, so like, generally speaking for me, like I would guess, and again, I don't know the exact number, but it's probably like less than 20 people nationally that I tend to respect in this injury industry, that when they say something about the Falcons, I go, and it's different from my opinion about the Falcons, I go, maybe I should reevaluate my opinion because I respect this person enough to think that they're not just blowing smoke up my butt. And I would highly recommend most people find that group of people. And I like to believe that I'm that person for many of you listening to the pod, that, I'm the type of person that, like, when Aaron says a thing, like, whether I agree with him or not, like, I respect the opinion enough to go like, let me give that a second thought than initially I had given it. And so a lot of my positivity now on the podcast is due to, something that has been reinforced by therapy. It's the idea that you hear constantly, you can only control what you can control. And, for me, I can really control the quality of this podcast Monday through Friday. I can't really control whether or not the Falcons win on Sunday or whatever. So, for me, to borrow a phrase from a popular book series, like, it's journey before destination. And what I interpret that as is, like, I'm not really worried about, the destination, meaning, the Falcons' success, failures, all that and more. I'm just going to try to enjoy the ride as much as I possibly can. What would be funny is, like, if you talk to me about things other than the Atlanta Falcons, you would probably find out that all my pessimism is now, like, devoted to other things that to me are much more bigger deals in the world than necessarily the Atlanta Falcons. It's like I got 99 problems, but the Atlanta Falcons ain't one of them. But I think a lot of my optimism and positivity towards the team is owed to, you know, the turnaround that the offensive line had. Because I think a lot of my negativity towards the team a year ago was because they were running it back with the same starting five, and understanding that, given how Arthur Smith wants to play football, like, you have to be able to control the line of scrimmage in order to do that. And running it back with a bottom five offensive line just did not give me really any optimism for the future. And obviously that's why you've heard me over the last 9 months just constantly praise Dwayne Ledford and his coaching staff for basically pulling off a miracle. And the old me would have been pessimistic about, the potential for regression on that offensive line. And certainly, I recognize the possibility that this offensive line does not perform as well as it did a year ago. And certainly we could fast forward 9 months from now and be talking about why did the Falcons disappoint this past season in 2023? And I would say, the offensive line taking a step back is one of potentially three pitfalls that could lead to us having that conversation. One of them being, Desmond Ridder being really bad this year and turning the ball over a bunch, or, excessive injuries could also impact the team, because there are some depth concerns at a number of positions, like we just talked about with the linebacker position. So, like, there's a lot of factors that could lead to the Falcons struggling this year. I acknowledge those possibilities, but for me, it's just like, why harp on them? It's a different attitude of, like, why focus on all the things that could go wrong versus let's talk about the things that can go right. And it's like, it's taken a while for me to, to enact that mindset. But, like, I understand that, like, no one wants to listen to a podcast every single day that's just sitting here, complaining about the Falcons for 30 minutes. And it's not to say that this positivity is an act that I'm putting on, but it is just one of those things where it's like, legitimately, like, I do feel better about the team, right? And a lot of that is owed to, for the last decade, we've looked at this Falcon team as being great in terms of skill position players, but being bad in the trenches, right? And now I look at this new team, and again, we'll see if they live up to these expectations. But I see a team that has the potential to have very good skill position players, like the old team did, and also be good in the trenches. And for me, that's part of the reason why, like, when I come across fans that are so down on this regime and down on the job that they're doing, I'm kind of baffled by that. And again, a lot of, I was in the same headspace, being down on this regime this time a year ago, because they hadn't figured out the trenches. But given, the improvements the offensive line had made, given the investment that they made in defensive line, given that they have some very talented players, at a lot of skill position players, like, I sit here and I go, like, to me, and again, clearly this is a subjective opinion, but, like, objectively, like, you can look at that and, like, I struggle to understand why a vocal minority of Falcon fans, I have to stress, it is a minority of Falcon fans, are so down on the current state of the team. And I think a lot of it is owed to basically the team, drafted or signed a player that you didn't want them to sign, or you didn't think they should sign. You wanted them to sign somebody else or draft somebody else. And for whatever reason, you're acting like that one decision, that one roster move is going to be the thing that makes or breaks the football team. And like, people are entitled to that opinion, and maybe those people wind up being right, who knows. But for me, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So that's kind of my thought process on that. I know that doesn't necessarily answer all your questions, Brigantor, that you brought up, but like, that's kind of the headspace I'm in. And we'll see, right? Like, if the national media is right on the Falcons and they, I don't know, win 6 games this year, then we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Again, I can't control that, but what I can control is, giving you guys a great podcast every single day, and that's what I'm striving for, and I hope you guys appreciate that. So that's what keeps me getting out of bed every single day, and they'll get me out of bed Sunday morning when I, rather than going out and grilling, or I'll probably go out and grill, but we'll see what happens. But we'll do that Matthew Bergeron breakdown probably Sunday evening, Monday morning, and we'll culminate this Locked On Desmond Ridder week here on the podcast. Obviously, this will not be the last time we talk about Desmond Ridder on the pod, but we'll repivot back to the draft class, because I know. Yeah, we gotta crank out this, Zach Harrison, Clark Phillips, etc. content. We got DeMarco Helms breakdowns and Jovan Gwynn breakdowns to come as well from the Locked On college shows as well. So a lot of great content coming your way. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, check out all the other great shows, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hope you guys have a great weekend.